Why don't you sit quietly and do nothing like a good little girl?
Why don't you use your hands?
Why don't you show us your amazing stuff?
Why don't you put those shoes on?
Why don't you guys try? Why don't you open it?
Why don't you give it a spin?
Why don't you meet me at the sport field in 5 minutes?
Why don't you sit down for a minute?
Why don't you ride it?
Why don't you go out there and do what you do best?
Why don't you join our team?
Then why don't you open them?
Why don't you ask everyone in LazyTown what their favorite song is?
Why don't you go and ask her?
Why don't you try it? Why don't you try this?
Why don't you go play outside?
Why don't you take my uncle and show him how it's done?
Why didn't you just throw it away?
Why don't you push the wagon away from the sheets?
Why don't you come this way? Why don't you climb into the cannon?
Why don't you talk to Pixar?
Why don't you give him this box here so he can be much, much faster? Why don't you give me the trophy?
Why don't you ask Mr. Fancy Pants over there?
Why don't you go out there and have some fun?
Why don't you put on the blindfold and find out? Why don't you come over and sit with us?
Why don't you run along and find me some fresh ingredients? Why don't you take the invitation to Miss Busybody while the chef and I finish everything?
Why don't you just retire?
Why don't you go stingy?
Don't worry, guys.